Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Moving Wall in Wareham, Massachusetts. It's indeed an honor this afternoon to stand here and represent the Wareham-New Bedford Lodge of Elks number 73. And to introduce the Master of Ceremonies for today's ceremony, the Chairman of the Veterans Committee for the Wareham-New Bedford Lodge of Elks, Mr. Theodore Hatch.
Thank you, Bob. Good afternoon, everyone. Just a couple of housekeeping and announcements before we begin. If you have a cell phone, could you kindly place them on silent, not to interrupt the service as we go along. As the handouts that most of you received, we have medical services and other things readily available for you if need be. If any of you are here on a time restriction and need to visit the wall, please feel free to do so at any time during the ceremony. On behalf of the Benevolent and Protective Order of Elks nationwide, we welcome you. We are represented here today by officers of the Grand Lodge, the Massachusetts Elks Association, the Elks Riders, our lodge, many other local lodges, veterans from all branches of the service, honored guests, and of course, the public at large. As we open our ceremony today, we'd like to thank all of you in attendance, but today is to honor those whose 58,000 plus names are inscribed on the wall behind you. They were there and they gave the ultimate sacrifice for the protection of our freedom in the United States. Our program will be presented in a chronological order of history and information about the wall. In keeping with the theme of today's program, highlighted on the veterans, introductions of our speakers will include no personal bios, merely their names and titles as related to the Elks organization. Would everyone kindly rise as our Lodge Chaplain, Richard Duffy Sr., delivers our invocation to begin the solemn ceremony.
Our Father, who art in heaven, we come to thee and humbly ask thy blessings upon this service here this afternoon. In all your wisdom, you have chosen these men and women here on these walls to be with you in heaven. Hear our prayers for those who we will never forget, who are missing in action and prisoners of war. We give thanks for their honor and courage for each one of them, and that they have paid the ultimate sacrifice. Heavenly Father, may you give comfort to those family and friends who's mourning the loss of their loved ones with thy tender love and mercy. Almighty God, we also pray for our servicemen and women who are protecting our country so we may have the freedom we share here in America. We also ask you to help us practice the benevolent work of our order and keep us faithful to the principles upon which our fraternity was founded: charity, justice, brotherly love, and fidelity. We ask you this through thy redeeming grace and power. Amen.
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 Thank you, Rick. You may be seated. For those that are not Elks, it should be noted that one of the Elks' obligations state the Elks are committed to their mission. So long as there are veterans, the Benevolent and Protective Order of Elks will never forget them. The Veterans Service Commission takes that pledge one step further and promises service to our nation's veterans and military members with a special focus on service to those in need. Keeping this motto in mind, I would like to share one story of many stories nationwide. On Friday, May 27, 2016, veteran Hank Snow received a chair lift renamed by Hank as a Chair of Life. Through the generosity of Lodge member Ray Cash, who donated the chair, and efforts by Lodge officers Perry Gerlach and Craig Shurtleff, our Lodge was able to improve the independability and quality of life to Hank, truly bringing the meaning of Elks Care and Elks Share to life. Hank spent 6 years attached to the Army for the period of October 1963 through December of 1969. In honorary discharge of the rank of E6, he also was the recipient of the Bronze Star Award. In a letter written to me, I quote, "For the first time in over 3 years, I've been to my basement. My workshop is still there. My wheeled shelving units are still there. My raised and padded custom floored area holding my washer and dryer is still there, and I can once again do my own laundry when I want to. This thing is wonderful and has restored a lot of use to me. Now I can do more for myself. This is freedom. Prior to introducing our guests for their brief messages, we are honored to present memorial wreaths in front of this hallowed wall. And when the ceremony is concluded, we will remove them and return them to our individual lodges, where they will be kept in loving memory of those that have given the ultimate sacrifice. Ladies and gentlemen, Area 2 Special Representative Craig W. Shurtleff will introduce those presenting wreaths.
Ladies and gentlemen, in token of the respect we have as Elks for the many Vietnam veterans in the memorial wall, the following lodges would like to present a wreath to the memory of the fallen. From the Wareham-New Bedford Lodge, presented by leading knight Joan Servison. From the Fall River Lodge, presented by Path's Exalted Ruler, Feliciano Freitas. From the Falmouth Lodge, presented by Exalted Ruler, William Dumas. From the Hyannis Lodge, presented by Exalted Ruler, Donna Medeiros. From the Middleborough Lodge, presented by Exalted Ruler, Michael Mott. From the Orleans Eastham Lodge, presented by Exalted Ruler, Lee Bowman. From the Plymouth Lodge, presented by Exalted Ruler, Michael Santos. From the Taunton Lodge, presented by Exalted Ruler, Rosemarie Monahan. And last but certainly not least, from the South District Past Exalted Rulers Association, presented by the President of the Association, Stephen Curran. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig. First up, guest speaker will be Jim Wong, Massachusetts Elks President.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's ceremony, and thank you for attending. I am honored to be speaking with you today on such an important occasion. We are here today to honor our heroes, to remember their achievements, their courage, and their dedication, and thank them for their sacrifices. Thinking of the heroes who are here today, and those who are here only in spirit, a person can help but feel awed by the enormity of what we encounter. We stand in the midst of patriots, as well as the family and friends of those who have served nobly. I'd like to ask the service members and veterans who are here to stand. Please be seated. Thank you for answering the call to duty. You have made our armed services one of the most respected in the world. Now, I'd like to ask the family members of any service member to stand. Please be seated. We know you have lived through difficult times and often taken the heavy load to keep the home fires burning. Thank you for what you have done. The service members we honor today came from all walks of life, but they shared several fundamental qualities. They possessed courage, pride, determination, selflessness, integrity, and dedication to duty. All the qualities needed to serve a cause larger than oneself. Many of them didn't ask to leave their homes to fight on distant battlefields. Many didn't even volunteer. They were called to be part of something bigger than themselves. They were ordinary people who responded in extraordinary ways in extreme times. They rose to the nation's call because they wanted to protect the nation, which has given them so much. Since the first shots at Lexington and Concord were fired and our Revolutionary War began, American men and women have been answering the nation's call to duty. Millions of Americans have fought and died on battlefields here and abroad to defend our freedom and our way of life. Today, members of our troops continue to make the ultimate sacrifice. And even as we lose them, more Americans are stepping forward to say, I am ready to serve. They follow in the footsteps of generations of fine Americans. Emotions are often high for the moving wall exhibit. The memorial is a half-size replica of the Vietnam Memorial Wall in Washington, D.C., and features the names of more than 58,000 Vietnam veterans who gave their lives or remain missing in action. Just how large is a group of 58,000? To put that number into perspective, more than 35,000 soldiers, 2,500 sailors, 2,500 airmen, and nearly 15,000 Marines paid the ultimate price. Their overwhelming support for bringing the moving wall to the community is shown by the number of people gathered in the crowd. People from all generations choose to attend. While many weren't even born to have memories of that time in our history, the legacy of the brave men and women lives on through memorials like the moving wall. The names are inscribed in the black granite walls and offer visitors the opportunity to trace their name and take a lasting memory home. There is not a state untouched by the Vietnam War. Our heroes, honored on the wall, represent the very best America has to offer. They reflect all races, religions, and social classes of our great nation. It's been said that these memorials reflect a hunger for healing. While I don't know if perfect healing ever occurs, I know that sometimes when the bone is broken, it will be stronger in the end if it's knit together well. I believe that in the decades since Vietnam, the healing has begun. And I hope for all those affected by all the nation's wars that they and their families find peace in knowing their sacrifice helped shape the great country we live in today. Thank you for attending. God bless you and your families. God bless our troops, and God bless America.
Thank you, Jim. Wareham-New Bedford Lodge of Elks Exalted Ruler Charles B. Anson.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dignitaries, and of course, our active duty personnel and families. I've been graciously asked to speak on a topic about the Vietnam War. The topic I will be addressing is how America became involved with the Vietnam War. Looking at that topic, how, prompts me to ask, why did America become involved with the Vietnam War? The U.S. got involved in the Vietnam War because it did not want another country going to communism, and therefore the Soviet sphere of influence. The U.S. government viewed its involvement in the war as a way to prevent a communist takeover of South Vietnam. This was part of the domino theory of a wider containment policy, with the stated aim of stopping spread of communism worldwide. The USA wanted to prevent areas of the world from falling under communist influence. The Cold War was at its height in the late 1940s and early 1950s, when the French appealed to the USA for aid. The U.S. government saw Vietnam as another Korea. The causes of the Vietnam War revolve around the simple belief held by America that communism was threatening to expand all over Southeast Asia. Neither the Soviet Union nor the United States could risk an all-out war against each other. Such was the nuclear military might of both. The Vietnam War was a long, costly armed conflict that pitted the communist regime of North Vietnam and its southern allies known as the Viet Cong against South Vietnam and its principal ally, the United States. The war began in 1954, though conflict in the region stretched back to the mid-1940s. After the rise of power of Ho Chi Minh and his Communist Viet Minh Party in North Vietnam, and continued against the backdrop of an intense Cold War between two global superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. More than 3 million people were in the Vietnam War. More than half were Vietnamese civilians. By 1969, at the peak of U.S. involvement in the war, more than 500,000 U.S. military personnel were involved in the Vietnam conflict. With the Cold War intensifying, the United States hardened its policies against any allies of the Soviet Union, and by 1955, President Dwight D. Eisenhower had pledged his firm support to Ngo Dinh Diem, President of the Government of the Republic of Vietnam and South Vietnam. With training and equipment from American military and police, Diem's security forces cracked down on Viet Minh sympathizers in the South, whom he called Viet Cong, or Vietnamese communist, arresting some 100,000 people, many of whom were tortured and executed. By 1957, the Viet Cong and other opponents of Diem's repressive regime began fighting back with attacks on government officials and other targets. And by 1959, they had began engaging South Vietnamese army forces in firefights. Since there was no declaration of the war, exact dates are sketchy. However, now it is widely accepted that the Vietnam War started on November 5th, 1955, and lasted until April 30th, 1975, which is roughly 20 years. In March 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson made the decision, with solid support from the American public, to send U.S. combat forces into battle in Vietnam. The United States officially entered the Vietnam War on March 8th, 1965. The first American combat troops, the 9th Marine Expeditionary Brigade, waited ashore at China Beach, north of Da Nang. There had already been limited U.S. naval action, and the bombing of North Vietnam had commenced. There were also 23,000 military advisors already on the ground. By June, 82,000 combat troops were stationed in Vietnam, and General William Westmoreland was calling for 175,000 more by the end of 1965, to shore up the struggling South Vietnamese army. Despite the concerns of some of his advisors about this escalation and about the entire war effort as well, as a growing anti-war movement in the U.S., Johnson authorized the immediate dispatch of 100,000 troops at the end of July 1965 and another 100,000 in 1966. In addition to the United States, South Korea, Thailand, Australia, and New Zealand also committed troops to fight in South Vietnam, albeit on a much smaller scale. In contrast to the air attacks on North Vietnam, the U.S. South Vietnamese war effort in the South was fought on the ground, largely under the command of General Westmoreland, in coordination with the government of General Nguyen Van Thao in Saigon. In general, U.S. military forces in the region pursued a policy of attrition, aiming to kill as many enemy troops as possible rather than trying to secure territory. By 1966, large areas of South Vietnam had been designated as free fire zones, from which all innocent civilians were supposed to have evacuated, and only enemy remained. Heavy bombing by B-52 aircraft or shelling made these zones uninhabitable, as refugees poured into camps in designated safe areas near Saigon and other cities. Even as the body count mounted steadily, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam and Viet Cong troops refused to stop fighting, encouraged by the fact that they could easily recover lost territory. Meanwhile, supported by aid from China and the Soviet Union, North Vietnam strengthened its air defenses. By 1967, the number of American troops in Vietnam was approaching 500,000, and U.S. casualties had reached 15,058 killed and 109,527 wounded. As the war stretched on, some soldiers came to mistrust their government's reasons for keeping them there, as well as Washington's claim that the war was being won. The later years of the war saw increased physical and psychological deterioration among American soldiers, including drug use, mutinies, and attacks by soldiers against officers and non-commissioned officers. Bombarded by horrific images of the war on their televisions, Americans on the home front turned against the war as well. In October 1967, some 35,000 demonstrators staged a mass anti-war protest outside the Pentagon. Opponents of the war argued that civilians, not enemy combats, were the primary targets and that the United States was supporting a corrupt dictatorship in Saigon. With his approval ratings dropping in that election year, Johnson called a halt to bombing in much of North Vietnam in March, though bombings continued in the South, and promised to dedicate the rest of his term to seeking peace rather than re-election. Johnson's new tack laid out in March 1968 speech met with a positive response from Hanoi, and peace talks between the U.S. and North Vietnam opened in Paris that May. Despite the later inclusion of the South Vietnamese and the National Liberation Front, the political arm of the Viet Cong, the dialogue soon reached an impasse, and after an election campaign marred by violence, Republican Richard M. Nixon defeated Hubert Humphrey to win the White House. Nixon sought to deflate the anti-war movement by appealing to a silent majority of Americans who he believed supported the war effort. In an attempt to limit the volume of American casualties, he announced a program of withdrawing troops, increasing aerial and artillery bombardment, and giving South Vietnamese control over ground operations. In addition to this policy, which he called Vietnamization, Nixon continued public peace talks conducted by Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, beginning in the spring of 1968. The North Vietnamese continued to insist on complete U.S. withdrawal as a condition of peace, and the next few years would bring even more carnage. Anti-war protests continued to build as the conflict wore on. In 1968 and 1969, there were hundreds of anti-war marches and gatherings throughout the country. On November 15th, 1969, the largest anti-war protest in American history took place in Washington, D.C., as over 250,000 Americans gathered peacefully, calling for withdrawal of American troops from Vietnam. The anti-war movement which was particularly strong on college campuses, divided Americans bitterly. For some young people, the war symbolized a form of unchecked authority they had come to resent. For other Americans, opposing the government was considered unpatriotic and treasonous. In January 1973, the United States and North Vietnam concluded a final peace agreement, ending open hostilities between the two nations. War between the North and South Vietnam continued, however, until April 30th, 1975, when DRV forces captured Saigon, renaming it Ho Chi Minh City. Ho himself died in 1969. The long conflict had affected an immense majority of the country's population. In 8 years of warfare, an estimated 2 million Vietnamese died, while 3 million were wounded, and another 12 million became refugees. War had decimated the country's infrastructure and economy, and reconstruction proceeded slowly. In the United States, the effects of the Vietnam War would linger long after the last troops returned home in 1973. The nation spent more than $120 billion on the conflict in Vietnam from 1965 to 1973. This massive spending led to widespread inflation, exacerbated by a worldwide oil crisis in 1973 and skyrocketing fuel prices. In conclusion, these are only the facts of the war, but the soldiers who fought and lost their lives in this war to protect our freedoms cannot fully be repaid. We as Americans have our freedom because of our veterans' sacrifices, whether they returned home or paid the ultimate price. All gave some gave all. God bless our veterans and our active military personnel and their families. Thank you all.
South District Deputy Ronald Chip Teal.
Good afternoon, members, guests, veterans, and friends. I stand here today humbled of given the opportunity to speak on the history of this great memorial and the story that it tells. Let's start where the story begins. Jan C. Scruggs, a wounded Vietnam War veteran. Upon his return to the United States, he began calling for a memorial to help with the healing process for the roughly 3 million Americans who served in the conflict. Using $2,800 of his own money, he formed the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund in 1979. The next step. On July 1st, 1980, in the Rose Garden, President Jimmy Carter signed the legislation reserving 3 acres in the northwest corner of the National Mall for the memorial. While this was taking place, fundraising had begun. All donations came from the private sector, and by 1981, some 275,000 Americans, along with corporations, foundations, veterans groups, civic organizations, and labor unions, had given $8.4 million to the project. No federal funds were used. Having raised the necessary funds, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund held a design contest. The guidelines stipulated that the memorial should contain the names of every American who died in Vietnam or remained missing in action. And it should also make no political statement about the war, and it needs to be in harmony with its surroundings. There were over 1,400 submissions. It was a bit overwhelming for the panel of 8 anonymous judges. In the end, though, The panel passed over every professional architect in favor of entry number 1026, a 21-year-old Yale University student, Maya Lin, who had created her design for a class project. Maya's concept of the memorial was to create a park within a park, a quiet, protected place unto itself, yet be in harmony with the gardens. The walls have a mirror-like surface reflecting the images of the surrounding trees, lawns, monuments, and visitors. The walls, they seem to stretch into the distance, directing us towards the Washington Monument in the east and the Lincoln Memorial to the west. Thus, bring the Vietnam Veterans Memorial into a historical context. On March 11th, 1982, the designs and plans received their final federal approval, and construction of the site began on March 16th, 1982. The memorial was completed in late October and dedicated on November 13th, 1982, climaxing a week-long salute to the Vietnam veteran. On November 11th, 1984, all three units, the wall, the statue, and the flag were combined, and the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund officially transferred control of the memorial to the National Park Service, and it became a national monument. The now completed Vietnam Veterans Memorial was accepted by the President of the United States on November 10th, 1984. In conclusion, when I was first given this section of the program, I was thinking, 5 to 7 minutes on basic history of the Vietnam Wall. I was like, let's see. I was 9 years old when the VVMF was founded, and I was in the 6th grade when it was dedicated. Okay. So off to Google search I went, as we do. And let me tell you, as I researched my topic, I realized the importance of this memorial. As I read on, I experienced every emotion that a grown man is allowed to experience. I was angry. I was sad, determined, grateful, and proud. Proud to be an American. Damn proud to be an American veteran. And proud to be a brother of the greatest fraternal organization that this country has ever seen, the Benevolent Protective Order of Elks, where our veterans will never be forgotten. May God bless our troops, our veterans, and may God bless all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chip. Massachusetts Elks Area 2 Special Rep, Craig Shurtleff.
Thank you, Ted. Ladies and gentlemen, in 1917, the world was at war, and then Grand Exalted Ruler Edward Ryder appointed what was known at the time as the War Relief Commission to study what the Order of Elks should do in this crisis. This was the beginning of our Order's dedication to our veterans. During World War I, under the auspices of the War Relief Commission, the Elks helped the nation to victory. Through the patriotism and generosity of our members, the Commission organized and equipped the first 2 base hospitals to reach France in support of our nation's wounded. In 1918, the Elks funded and built a 700-bed hospital in Boston, Massachusetts, and gave it to the federal government. This hospital was the forerunner of the VA medical centers we have today. This dedication, service, and support continued during the Vietnam War. The Defense Department was concerned with the morale of our 400,000 troops fighting communist aggression because of the anti-American sentiments being reported on the home front. After much discussion, it was decided that a Letters from Home campaign would help counteract all the negative acts emancipating from this country. The Elks again answered the call and flooded these fine young defenders of freedom with letters expressing our gratitude for the sacrifices they were making for our country. When the Commission learned that wounded veterans from Vietnam were sweltering in Tripler Army Medical Center that lacked air conditioning, they provided 24 air-conditioned units so that these military personnel might recover in relative comfort. As Elks, we pride ourselves on Americanism and service to our veterans. This support has been unwavering during the 150-year history of our order. We foster respect for our nation's flag and those who have fought beneath it. This respect was never more prevalent than in 1907 when the Grand Lodge of the Benevolent and Protective Order of Elks designated June 14th as the first Flag Day. The Grand Lodge of the Order adopted mandatory observance of the occasion by every lodge in 1911, and that requirement continues today. We continue that tradition by placing our nation's flag at a position of honor prior to every meeting so that our members will never forget the majesty of its silken folds and those who have fought beneath it. Ladies and gentlemen, please stand and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. In memory of the thousands of flags that were folded and given to families of the brave men and women who are remembered by this monument, we would like to present the folding of our flag in the true meaning of each fold. Our flag will be folded by Samantha Parker and Joseph Naran, second-class cadets from the Mass Maritime Academy. The first fold is a symbol of life. The second fold is for our belief in eternal life. The third fold is made in honor and remembrance of the veterans departing rank who gave a portion of his or her life for the defense of our country to obtain peace throughout the world. The fourth fold stands for our weaker nature. As American citizens trusting in God, it's to Him we turn in times of peace as well as war for His divine guidance. The fifth fold is a tribute to America. In the words of Stephen Decatur, our country, in dealing with our other countries, may she always be right, but it is still our country, right or wrong. The sixth fold is where our heart lies. It's with our flag that we pledge allegiance to the flag and the republic it stands for. The seventh fold is a tribute to our armed forces, for it is the armed forces that protect our country and flag against enemies, whether they be domestic or foreign. The eighth fold is a tribute to the one who entered into the valley of the shadow of death, that we might see the light of day and to honor our mother, for whom it flies on Mother's Day. The ninth fold is a tribute to womanhood, for it is through their faith, love, loyalty, and devotion that the character of the men and women who have made this country great have been molded. The 10th fold is a tribute to Father, for he has given his sons and daughters for the defense of our country since he or she was first born. The 11th fold, in the eyes of Hebrew citizens, represents the lower portion of the seal of King David and King Solomon, and glorifies in their eyes the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The 12th fold, in the eyes of a Christian citizen, represents an emblem of eternity and glorifies in their eyes God, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. When the flag is completely folded, which some consider the 13th fold, the stars are uppermost, reminding us of our national motto, "In God we trust." Please present this flag to Exalted Ruler Chuck Hanson, as it will be preserved as a memory of this occasion at the Wareham-New Bedford Lodge of Elks. Thank you for your kind attention, and please be seated.
Massachusetts Elks Veterans Service Committee Chairman Gerald Bagley.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us here on this lovely, breezy, sunshine afternoon. I can guarantee you that as a young man stepping onto the shores of a faraway place called Vietnam, it was a lot harder. Not knowing what to expect, bugs, enemy lying await for you, and a country back home not sure whether they wanted to support this conflict or not. It was a sad, sad time back then. We lost a lot of good men. Some of these men were not asked to go, they were told to go. Back then, we had a draft system. I too, when this conflict began, I was only 2 years old. And it lasted for a long time. Long enough that when I was 17 years old, I was able to join the Navy and go and help our brethren, our country. But back then, being a young man, not knowing what was in store for you, you've heard the history of the wall today. You've heard the history of why we got involved in this conflict. You've heard a lot of statistics of how many fine young men died or were lost or still missing in action, or worse, became POWs, prisoners of war. Along with all those fine young men, there were also 8 women that died in Vietnam during that conflict. 5 of them perished when their Galaxy C-5A went down, when they were being pulled out of Vietnam to come back home. The POWs back then, they suffered horrendous torture. Physical torture, broken bones, scars, any physical pain that they endured, those can all be healed. The physical pain goes away eventually, hopefully. But what was worse was the emotional scars that plagued and still plagues today our veterans of that conflict. I myself have a hard time calling it a conflict when we truly were, in our eyes, at war. A conflict is, the meaning of a conflict to us meant nothing. We were there, and we were there to protect the ideals of our great country, for which this flag flies over. We hope that the emotional scars will someday fade. And that was probably the worst. Like I said before, physical pain and injuries heal. It takes a lot more time, and most times, psychological injuries don't go away. And their torturers knew this. They would often tell them when they couldn't get any reaction from the physical pain that they were inflicting on our POWs, they would then attack them mentally, saying that things had changed at home, their mother had passed away, grandmother, or anything that they could do to break these men. And those are the scars that don't heal. And I'm sure we have a few Vietnam veterans in this audience today that have had emotional scars. We try to get along, we try to move along, but every once in a while, those emotional scars do surface. For some, it's worse than others. MIAs. We don't know what happened to them. Their families don't know what happened to them. They have never been able to close the book on their loved ones' lives. Many young men over there weren't asked to go. They were told to go. Some of us decided to go, but not really knowing when we were that young what we were getting ourselves into. But when asked to serve our country, we did. And for most part, we didn't do it for our country. We did it for the man standing next to us, on either side, behind us or in front of us. Those are the people that kept us going so that we could get home to our loved ones. When we came home, nobody was looking for a hero's welcome. They were just looking to get back to their families and their loved ones. So I ask you all, in this climate and political climate that we live in today, where monuments are being torn down left and right, those monuments, just like this monument here, are a source of our history. Our history, whether it be wrong, right, indifferent, bad, good, we're all human beings. We all have our own opinions. Sometimes they don't agree with one another, but that's what makes this country such a great place to live in. So I thank you all for coming here today and viewing this solemn piece of history. And may we never, ever, ever forget the lives of those that were lost. And most important, the family members that still lost those people, never got to say goodbye to them. Never, ever, ever forget our men and women in our military, because they fight for our ideals. So if you enjoy your way of life, please thank a veteran. When you're in the airport traveling or anywhere in public, you see a service man or woman in uniform, trust me, thank you for your service means an awful lot to them. And it'll mean a lot to you. Don't forget to thank our veterans. God bless you all. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Jerry. May we all remember that no matter what branch of service, whether an enlisted person or officer, whether a reservist or a career person, every veteran wrote a check to the United States of America of up to including their life for the protection of our freedom. On behalf of the Benevolent and Protective Order of Elks of the United States of America, thank you. And thank you for attending, and remember to thank a vet, because as long as there are veterans, our order will not forget them. As we conclude our program today, I would like to ask all to kindly remove their hats as we present Staff Sergeant Barry Sadler's Ballad of the Green Beret, made famous back in 1966.
Fighting soldiers from the side, fearless men who jump and die, men who mean just what they say, the brave men of the Green Beret, silver wings upon their chest. These are men, America's best. 100 men protest today, but only 3 in the rain. Trained to live nature's land, trained in combat, hand to hand. Men who fight by night and day, courage take the race. Back at home, the white light upon their chests. These These are men, America's best. 100 men will test today, but only 3 in the Green Beret. Back at home, our young wife hates the Green Beret has met his fate. He has died for those oppressed, leaving her put silver wings on my son's chest. Make him one of America's best. He'll be a man they'll test one day. Have him win the Green Beret. Wah!
Thank you once again for attending, and if you haven't already, please take a few moments and follow the path and pass by the wall. I'm sure these veterans are looking down upon us as we speak. This ceremony is dismissed. Thank you all.
Nice job. Excellent. You can see it. Excellent job.
Can we get these two in too?
Yeah, come on up.
Yeah, come on.
Yes. Sure. Maybe we should squeeze it a little.